Well, welcome everyone. We are delighted you've joined us for the launch of the 2025 Production Gap Report. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Lindsay Burton, Communications Officer at Stockholm Environment Institute's U.S. Center. We're here to announce our latest findings on the global production gap. The production gap quantifies the misalignment between governments' planned and projected production of coal, oil, and gas, and the global production pathways consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, according to the Paris Agreement. This report was produced by Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, Climate Analytics, and International Institute for Sustainable Development, known as IISD. More than 50 researchers from institutions all over the globe contributed to this work. Joining us today are the coordinating lead authors of the Production Gap Report, who will present our results today. Derek Brokoff, Climate Policy Program Director at SEI US, based in Seattle, and Emily Ghosh, Equitable Transitions Program Director at SEI US, based in New York State. We are also delighted to be joined by some additional report partners today: Olivier Bois-Van-Kursk, Policy Advisor at IISD, and Neil Grant, Senior Expert at Climate Analytics. We will hear more from them after we present our findings. We're proud to welcome a very special guest today, but before I introduce her, I'd like to remind everyone of some guidelines. After we hear from the report authors, we are happy to take your questions, and I will help facilitate that. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which is different from the chat box. I will do my best to read out questions in order and get to as many different people as possible. With that, let's continue. Many of us know Mary Robinson as the trailblazing former Irish president who led her country from 1997 to 2002. But she is also an ardent champion of tackling climate change. President Robinson was a founding member of the Elders, a group of world leaders initiated by Nelson Mandela in 2007 that advocates for peace, human rights, and a sustainable planet. Additionally, she is co-founder of Project Dandelion, a women-led movement to advance climate justice, addressing issues ranging from subsidies for fossil fuel companies to scaling a fair and accessible energy future. She has been an advisory board member of the European Climate Foundation and Sustainable Energy for All, host of the climate-focused Mothers of Invention podcast, member of the Campaign for Nature's Global Steering Committee, and today she shares her insights with us as we launch the new Production Gap Report. The Production Gap Report team is honored to welcome President Mary Robinson. Mary, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And dear friends, we're gathered here to talk about the Production Gap Report. Sadly, 10 years after Paris, that gap has widened into a vast gulf between what governments have promised and what they are planning. And now, with the recent ICJ advisory opinion, it's clear this gap is not just political, it is legal. The court unanimously found that countries are legally obliged to act to keep the world within the 1.5 degrees limit. This is not an unbridgeable gap. It's one we can and one we must close. The longer we leave it, the longer we leave the gap unaddressed, the deeper and more dangerous it becomes. And therefore, what I want to talk about at this moment is courage. I know how many competing challenges our leaders face: conflict, economic strain, and the deep divides in so many societies. The burden of leadership is heavy, but courage is what leadership demands, and it's what this moment requires. The findings of this report are stark. Governments in aggregate still plan to produce far more fossil fuels than is consistent with a safe climate. By 2030, production plans exceed the Paris-aligned levels by more than 120%. In fact, of the 20 countries profiled in this report, they continue to plan fossil fuel production at levels completely inconsistent with their net zero climate so-called ambitions. Taken together, governments now plan even higher levels of coal production to 2035 and gas production to 2050 than they did in 2023. Planned oil production continues to increase to 2050. These plans undermine countries' Paris Agreement commitments and go against expectations that under current policies, global demand for coal, oil, and gas will peak before 2030. If these plans are realized, fossil fuel production in 2050 will be 4.5 times higher than consistent with 1.5 degrees. Compared with the 2023 assessment, the gap has deepened. 11 of the 20 major producing countries have increased near-term production plans. More than half are planning significant increases in gas, often described as a so-called transition fuel, but with no transition plan in sight. And still, governments pour billions into subsidies and support for fossil fuel production, locking us into this harm. The ICJ has underlined that such actions may no longer just be reckless, they could be wrongful. And every year of delay locks us deeper into dependence, which will make the eventual transition steeper, more abrupt, and, of course, more unjust. And yet, there are signs of hope in the report. 6 countries are now developing scenarios for domestic fuel production aligned with national and global net zero targets, up from 4 in 2023. But 6 is not enough. 6 is too few, too fragile, and against the prevailing tide of expansion. As governments prepare to submit their third round of nationally determined contributions, this is not just a procedural step, it's both a moral and a legal test. To close the gap, they need to stop expanding fossil fuel production. They need to hardwire production cuts into their energy transition plans. They need to redouble international cooperation to ensure the bridge we build is one of justice that carries workers, communities, and the most vulnerable safely across. This production gap report is a mirror held up to our collective courage, or our lack of it thus far. And that's why I call on leaders to be courageous. Honor the promise of Paris, not slowly, not someday, but now, at the speed that this crisis demands, and with the mindset needed to overcome it. As Nelson Mandela often said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Robinson. We are thrilled you could share your time and comments with us today. Believe it or not, that was not our main event. For that, we now turn to SEI's Derek Brokoff and Emily Ghosh, who will detail the findings of the 2025 Production Gap Report. Derek, please take it away.
Thanks, Lindsay. And thank you so much, President Robinson. That was we're honored to have you introduce the report, and that was a great overview of our findings. So what I'd like to do now is take a few moments with my co-authors to summarize the report in a bit more detail. So just for background, the Production Gap Report is a series that was launched in 2019, designed to complement the United Nations Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report series. And it introduces this concept, which we'll go into here in a bit more in a moment, of a fossil fuel production gap. So the PGR, as Lindsay and Mary have already introduced, tracks the discrepancy between the global levels of fossil fuel production planned or projected by governments and those consistent with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. This 2025 report updates the production gap analysis that was conducted in 2023 using current country plans and projections. So it follows the same methodology, which means it allows a direct comparison to the 2023 results. And in this report, we update the country profiles for the same set of 20 key producer countries, summarizing their climate ambitions and production plans and projections. So the report is very much a collaborative effort led by SEI, but assisted by our colleagues, of course, at IISD and Climate Analytics. And we're also grateful, extremely grateful to the many reviewers who helped peer review the report and contributed to reviewing different sections, in particular the country updates. So this slide here shows the production gap itself. And what I'd like to do is take a few moments to walk through what this chart is showing and how we determine the production gap. So to quantify the production gap, we first identify the global pathways of fossil fuel production that would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is with those. So those lines are shown here by the purple and green lines, along with their respective interquartile ranges. Those are the shaded areas around those two lines. So these pathways represent total coal, oil, and gas supply intended for all energy and non-energy uses, and are informed by selected mitigation scenarios from the IPCC's sixth assessment report. So in a nutshell, these model-generated scenarios chart out cost-optimized pathways for limiting warming to a given temperature threshold, relying on different combinations and extents of major mitigation strategies to transform our energy and land use systems to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by the middle of the century. And next, we estimate the so-called government plans and projections pathway, which is shown by the red line. So the solid red line is the government plans and projections pathway that we determined currently for the 2025 analysis. The dotted line is the pathway that we calculated in the 2023 analysis. So you can see the difference there. And the GPP represents our estimate of the global levels of fossil fuel production implied by governments' plans and projections based on our review of recent and publicly available national energy outlooks and strategies of 19 major fossil fuel producing countries as of August 2025. So there's one country out of the 20 that we profile in the report. South Africa does not publish plans and projections, so this GPP is based on the other 19. So these 19 countries account for around 80% of global fossil fuel production. Their aggregate projections are then scaled up to a global pathway based on these countries' estimated shares of future global production as modeled by the International Energy Agency under a scenario that's consistent with their stated climate policies. So essentially, we look at what they contribute to global fossil fuel production, and then that's scaled up based on the IEA's projections. And the production gap is the discrepancy between the global levels of fossil fuel production under the government plans and projections pathway and those under the 1.5 or 2 degree consistent pathways in any given year. Now, one thing to note this time around is, again, we've relied on the same methodology. The 1.5 and 2 degree consistent pathways that we compare the GPP to are the same 1.5 and 2 degree consistent pathways that we used in the 2023 analysis. And this is largely because the IPCC has yet to release a new ensemble of scenarios. But one of the implications here is that the production gap is unfortunately larger, arguably larger than what we've depicted here. And this is because if you look at the historical emissions, that black line to the left, emissions have now exceeded levels in those pathways for several years at this point. So we've already lost time in trying to close the production gap. And I'll say a few more words about that at the end. So we also show the global production pathways implied by countries' stated climate policies and by countries' announced climate pledges as of September 2024, so a year ago, as modeled by the International Energy Agency. And these pathways are shown by the solid and dashed gold lines in this diagram. Finally, I want to note that fossil fuel production can be represented in several different units. So quantifying the production pathways in energy-based units allows for a direct comparison to the model outputs of the IPCC assessed scenarios. But we can also aggregate across coal, oil, and gas to represent production in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions expected to be released from extraction and combustion activities as plotted in this figure. So you can see the units on the left-hand side are billions of tons of CO2 equivalent. And this allows for comparability with other climate assessments like the UNEP emissions gap report. So in terms of findings this time around, the key one, of course, is that governments in aggregate still plan to produce far more fossil fuels than would be consistent with limiting global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Countries are now collectively planning even more fossil fuel production than 2 years ago. In particular, the near-term gap has increased with projected 2030 production exceeding levels consistent with 1.5 degrees by more than 120%, and that's up from 110% in the 2023 analysis. As in the 2023 analysis, projected total fossil fuel production in 2050 remains more than 4.5 times higher than levels consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees and 2.5 times higher than levels consistent with 2 degrees. And finally, governments' fossil fuel production plans also remain well above global levels implied by their stated climate mitigation policies and their announced pledges under the Paris Agreement, which are, again, the solid and dotted gold lines in the figure, respectively. Looking at individual fuels, taken together, governments now plan even higher levels of coal production to 2035 and gas production to 2050 than they did in 2023. Planned oil production continues to increase out to 2050. The near-term gap results from government plans and projections. The increase in the near-term gap for 2030 results from government plans for expanded coal and gas production. Aggregate planned coal production for 2030 is 7% higher than was estimated in the 2023 analysis, and planned gas production is 5% higher. So the increase in projected coal production is largely due to updates in the baseline forecast from China's state-owned National Petroleum Company, which now projects a slower decline in production until 2030. So to be clear, with that, China accounts for 54% of global coal production. So what China does drives a lot of the global projections. China is still projecting lower coal production in 2030 than it produced in 2023. But its most recent projection is higher than the projection in 2020 it had in 2023. So the decline is less steep currently than was projected in 2023. Hence, the higher level of global production relative to what was projected in 2023. Hopefully that's clear. So their projections are not as much lower as they were 2 years ago. While projected coal production declines after 2030, planned oil and gas production continued to increase to 2050. So despite the projected decline in coal production, however, the global production gap for coal remains the largest of all, around 500% higher than the median 1.5 degree pathway in 2030. The gap for oil remains largely unchanged from 2 years ago at about 31% higher than the 1.5 degree pathway. And finally, expanded plans for gas production lead to planned levels exceeding the median 1.5 degree pathway by 92% in 2030. So now I'll turn it over to Emily to review the updates to the country profiles that we conducted for this report.
Thanks, Derek. So much of the data that was used to calculate the production gap is based on our analysis of 20 key fossil fuel producing countries. And of these 20 countries, projections were only available for 19. As Derek mentioned, we did not have projections for South Africa. And in chapter 3 of the report, we detailed the findings of each country within a country profile. The data and information are largely derived from publicly available government data sources, and the profiles themselves have undergone review by country experts. And so the 20 countries profiled in this report are the same as those featured in the 2023 production gap report. We selected these countries based on their global ranking in coal, oil, or gas production, their stated climate commitments, and the availability of data for analysis. And so not only do these 20 countries represent 82% of global fossil fuel production, they also account for around 70% of consumption. The figure here shows extraction-based emissions, where emissions from burning fossil fuels are attributed to the country where those fossil fuels were extracted. And the countries profiled account for 84% of global extraction-based emissions in 2022. While there are significant variations in contributions across countries and across fossil fuels, 3 countries stand out. China, the US, and the Russian Federation were responsible for more than half of extraction-based emissions. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so governments play a central role in setting the direction of future fossil fuel production, which is why we focused on governments. Governments' plans, projections, policies, and incentives, including subsidies, guide and influence private sector decisions and fossil fuel industries. But focusing on governments also allows us to compare their fossil fuel production plans to their climate ambitions. This year, governments are expected to submit a new round of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which detail their plans for mitigating climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through 2035. So within the profiles we've developed, we summarize each country's latest climate ambitions, provide policy updates on their energy transition, provide updates to production plans and projections, updates on government support, including financial support for production, as well as other developments. Next slide, please. What we found is that the majority of countries profiled have net zero targets, and compared to our 2023 analysis, we've seen that several countries have moved to enshrining their targets into law. But at the same time, we found that 17 of the 20 countries profiled in this report plan to increase fossil fuel production to 2030 and even beyond. For 11 of these countries, these increases are higher than what they had planned in 2023, attributing to this wider short-term production gap as was previously discussed. Many of the countries profiled signed the Glasgow Statement, committing to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Some countries have moved to reduce fossil fuel support, but the majority continue to provide substantial financial support for fossil fuels, such as through direct investments in infrastructure, streamlining of environmental assessment and contracting procedures, providing tax incentives, credits, and opening up new areas for exploration and development. As a result, the fiscal support provided by countries for fossil fuels remains quite high, even now. Next slide, please. Thank you. During COP28 in Dubai, a historic agreement was reached calling for transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems so as to achieve net zero by 2050. However, generally, as you can see, there still appears to be a strong disconnect between climate commitments, including net zero climate ambitions, compared to countries' fossil fuel production plans. In addition to coal, 13 profiled countries are ramping up gas production. The four largest gas producer countries, the US, the Russian Federation, Qatar, and China, are responsible for more than half of this growth in gas production under the Global Production Pathways scenario from 2024 to 2030. Many countries state gas as a transition fuel. They're investing heavily in new gas infrastructure, locking in fossil fuel dependence for years to come, but they don't provide explicit future plans for when and how they'll completely transition away from gas. And while not transition related, there's significant efforts instead being made to reduce fossil fuel related operational emissions, especially methane from fossil fuel production. Membership in the Global Methane Pledge has grown to 160 countries, up from 102 years ago. A coalition of major oil and gas companies announced an oil and gas decarbonization charter targeting reductions in all operational emissions and aiming for net zero upstream methane emissions by 2030. While these are important, it still doesn't tackle Scope 3 emissions, which involve the production and use of fossil fuels themselves. There is some positive developments in that 6 countries are now developing scenarios for domestic fossil fuel production aligned with national and global net zero targets, up from 4 in 2023. Also, multiple countries remain committed to just energy transition partnerships. Coordinated international efforts are key to the energy transition, particularly given countries' different responsibilities and capabilities to the climate problem. JETPs highlight how governments with greater transition capacity can help finance transition efforts in countries with limited resources. In addition to financial and other supports for the transitions in other countries, governments with greater transition capacity should also aim for more ambitious reductions for themselves. Notably, many countries are exploring additional platforms and models like the JETPs for supporting energy transitions and are actively planning for it. Now I'll turn it back to Derek to conclude.
Thanks, Emily. So to close things out here, I wanted to return to a point I made earlier, which is the 1.5 and 2 degree line scenarios that we used for this analysis are the same ones that we used in the 2023 analysis. And as I was noting earlier, the production of fossil fuels and associated emissions have been higher than those pathways for several years now. And so because fossil fuel production and use in recent years have exceeded those 1.5 and 2 degree line trajectories, future production will need to decline even more steeply to compensate. So unfortunately, the production gap is arguably more significant, more substantial than what we presented in this analysis already. And what this means is that reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of the century will require cutting fossil fuel production and use to the very lowest levels possible. So how can the production gap be closed? We would highlight 4 different recommendations that continue to align with the recommendations in our prior reports. So number 1, align fossil fuel production plans and projections with climate ambitions. and explicitly integrate plans for reducing production within wider energy transition efforts. And in particular, this is going to require greater transparency on the part of many fossil fuel producing countries. Although it's not true for every country, for many countries, there continues to be a lack of regular standardized reporting of fossil fuel production projections. And that needs to improve going forward if we're going to hold countries accountable and if countries are going to be able to align production with their fossil fuel production plans with their climate ambitions. Second, countries need to adopt deliberate, coordinated policies to ensure a just transition away from fossil fuels. Coordinating the wind down of fossil fuel supply with the wind down of fossil fuel demands will be essential for avoiding locking in unsustainable levels of fossil fuel infrastructure and avoiding the stranding of assets associated with fossil fuel production that could impede energy transitions. So it's important not just to address the demand for fossil fuels, but also to adopt policies that explicitly transition away from and phase down fossil fuel production. Countries need to continue to aim for a near total phase out of coal production and use by 2040 and a combined reduction in oil and gas production and use by 3/4 by 2050 from 2020 levels at a minimum. And to be clear there, countries are not yet have not submitted stated climate ambitions that would meet those goals, but we continue to argue that this is what countries need to shoot for, in particular given constraints, likely constraints on carbon dioxide removal potential and the potential for carbon capture and storage. And it's all the more urgent again because of the widening gap that I alluded to earlier. And finally, countries need to redouble cooperative efforts to ensure a just transition globally. This addressing fossil fuel production will require international coordination and negotiation, and for countries to recognize their differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. Governments with greater transition capacity should aim for more ambitious reductions and help finance the transition efforts in countries with more limited capacities through vehicles like the JETPs that Emily alluded to earlier. And with that, I will bring things to a close and we'll turn it back over to Lindsay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek and Emily. You and the team have done such tremendous work on this. Before we open the floor to questions, I'd like to initiate discussion with our report partners who can provide further context and perspective. Let's start with Olivier at IISD. Olivier, many countries such as Brazil, the upcoming COP30 host, continue to build out fossil fuel production infrastructure with the intention of developing their export markets. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency, and now EMBER, predict a peak in demand for all fossil fuels by 2030. Olivier, how can we reconcile those contradictory trends?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. That's indeed like an important question. And indeed, like there's several countries and major producers that are planning to expand their fossil fuel production. And this is not just Brazil, but also like Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Canada, the US. They're all moving with the largest increase globally. And what is quite damning is that these are mostly designed for exports. Just at a time when indeed, like not only the IEA and EMBER are planning for, well, they're projecting a peak in fossil fuel demand before 2030. And actually, like it's not just them, but all major forecaster actually predicts a peak in oil demand before 2030 under current policies. And just like OPEC and the US Energy Information Administration that plans peak for later. And even oil and gas companies project a pre-2030 peak for oil. For example, like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Equinor, even consultancies such as McKinsey, Bloomberg, DNV, project this peak. And things look slightly different for gas, but the evidence for this turning point away from fossil fuel is already quite clear. And just this year, we've seen China, for example, plateauing their fossil fuel demand, while Pakistan and other countries across Africa have significantly ramped up their solar power capacity deployment to a level that just a few years ago would have been totally unimaginable. And other countries such as Germany, France, US, Brazil, and Pakistan, they have peaked their fossil fuel demand already. And after reaching a plateau, like demand falls quite precipitously. So the question of peak demand is not a question of if it's going to happen, but it's a question of when, whether and how fast. And while there's a lot of effort to block and delay this transition by locking in gas deal and infrastructure for transport, many net importer of fossil fuel are actually increasingly seeing renewable and electrification as key and essential for their energy security goal, as well as their climate goal. So decision makers should really take all of this into consideration and be aware of the transition risks of ramping up their fossil fuel production, as many of these expansion plans that we're seeing, that we observe in the country profile, would actually not pay off in a world that warms well above 2 degrees. No, sorry, like many of these expansion projects are likely to become stranded assets because they would only pay off in a world that warms well above 2 degrees Celsius. So government-backed plans for new fossil fuel projects are evidently quite deeply misaligned with climate goals, but also with the market trends as we expect this peak demand. So in essence, and I'll end with this, these fossil fuel expansion plans are not only economically reckless, but they're also a deliberate gamble against the success of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Olivier. We also have Neil with us today at Climate Analytics. Neil, we're barreling towards the 1.5 degrees limit at pace currently, and it looks highly likely that we will overshoot that barrier. What does this mean for fossil fuels?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay, and it's great to be here today. What I want to highlight is that overshooting 1.5 degrees only strengthens the need for a fossil phase out. And that's for three key reasons. First is that we know getting below 1.5 degrees is going to be critical. If people frame trying to get back below 1.5 as a radical idea, I don't think it is. I think it's a scientific, ethical, and moral imperative. What's radical is accepting the long-term impacts of staying above 1.5 degrees in terms of loss of polar ice caps, multi-meter sea level rise, permanent loss of glaciers, the list goes on. So we know that we need to get back below 1.5 degrees if we do overshoot, as seems likely at the moment. But we also know that getting back below 1.5 degrees will be really hard. You know, we've seen in the pathways that we use in this report and the continuing growing evidence base that scaling carbon dioxide removal, one of our levers to bring temperatures back down, is going to be very challenging. And betting on large-scale carbon dioxide removal is an incredibly risky strategy. And so we know that coming back down will be hard. And therefore, we know that any excess fossil fuels that we are enabled to continue to be extracted, continue to be burned out across the rest of the 21st century only makes that task of getting back below 1.5 degrees harder. Because every ton that we dig up and every ton that we burn will mean that some carbon dioxide removal that we do enable to scale, rather than being used to bring temperatures back down, is being used to compensate for continued fossil fuel extraction and consumption. And so as we move towards an overshoot of 1.5 degrees, and as we think about how to limit the extent of that overshoot, limit the duration, that only strengthens the necessity and urgency of a fossil phase out, which is, I think, what this report shows and is calling for.
Many thanks to you, Neil and Olivier, and to all our report partners. Now we'll take your questions. Again, please navigate to Zoom's Q&A function and add yourself to the queue. I will pitch your question to our panel of experts and attempt to cover questions from as many different people as possible. Thank you so much. All right, let's get into it. We have a question from Alexei. Have you tried to look into private fossil fuel majors such as Exxon and BP? their projections could be more realistic. Emily, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. So as we alluded to during the presentation, we largely focus on governments within our report because of the major role that they play in setting the direction of fossil fuel production, their regulations, their policies, their incentives, their leasing of oil and gas blocks, opening up lands. Like, these make such a difference in the direction of that fossil fuel production companies will take. And so I think that's one big reason why we focus on governments. And another is it allows us to compare their fossil fuel plans and projections to what they plan on in terms of their climate ambitions. So this is another big reason. As we go through in the report, the production gap is largely based on the national countries' climate ambitions and their net zero goals, and to ensure that there's alignment between their plans and in terms of fossil fuel production, as well as their emissions reductions that we're not seeing at the moment. And so, during COP30, in their submissions of the upcoming NDCs, it'll be important to see if there's greater alignment or even mentioning of the reduction of fossil fuel production in their latest round of climate ambitions. So thank you for the question, though. Back to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Emily. Next, we have from Andrew. For your gas figures, are you taking into account recent evidence, both academic analysis and satellite remote sensing, that fugitive methane emissions from gas extraction and transport are higher than reported? Neil, would you be able to take that one?
Yeah, happy to. So in the quantitative side of the analysis, we haven't updated our analytical pipeline from 2023. And the reason for that is that we wanted to be able to really directly compare what does the production gap look like now when calculated with that same methodology as it did then. And I think that's really helpful because it shows us really depressingly that using the exact same methodology, the gap has widened. Countries are over the last 2 years have not responded to the call made at COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels and instead are doubling down on extraction. But you're really right that in recent years, we've seen a lot of evidence, both in the academic literature, but particularly from satellite analysis as well, which shows that vast amounts of methane are leaking out into the atmosphere across the world in pipelines and extraction wells and in distribution systems all over the world. Now, in our analysis, we apply the same emissions factors to our government plans and projections pathway and to our 1.5 aligned pathways. So the percentage gap in terms of how much higher gas production plans are in 2030 compared to our 1.5 pathways wouldn't necessarily change in a relative term if we update the analysis. But I think what this latest analysis shows is that the idea of gas being a transition fuel remains simply that, an idea that is not backed up by reality. In locking in new gas infrastructure, particularly with these high methane leakages upstream, is not a solution for addressing the climate crisis. And we need to rapidly move away from not just coal and not just oil, but also gas towards zero carbon alternatives.
Thank you so much, Neil. We do have a couple of questions asking about which are the 6 countries now developing scenarios for domestic fossil fuel production aligned with national and global net zero targets. Emily, would you be able to take that one?
Sure, I'm happy to start responding, but Derek, others, feel free to jump in. So the 6 countries that have published or are developing scenarios for fossil fuel production aligned with global net zero targets include Canada, China, Germany, and Indonesia. And Brazil and Colombia have plans for producing scenarios in line with their net zero ambitions. It's important to note that these scenarios are not necessarily a reflection of countries' actual production plans, nor are they reflected in their NDC commitments, but And in some cases, they might be informational as a way to explore possible futures. Nevertheless, it's a sign of progress that countries are looking at fossil fuel production plans and analyzing against their net zero ambitions. And so, yeah, hopefully in the future, we'll see more countries producing these plans and more countries integrating it with their actual fossil fuel production plans and targets. Thank you.
Anyone else have anything to add to that? All right, I'll go on to the next question. Question from Alexei. How do you explain a huge gap between nationally determined contributions and national fossil fuel projections? Who can take that one for us?
I can come in to start, and then I'm sure others will join in. I think one of the things that this shows is the real dangers of siloed thinking in government systems. In many places, the ministries who are tasked with thinking about natural resource management and extraction are not well integrated with those who are thinking about a government's climate commitments. And that can lead to this sort of schizophrenic situation where different elements of the same government are making targets in different places, and that what that does is fundamentally undermine confidence in investors and other actors that a government is serious about the energy transition. And we know that key to effective policy is that it's perceived as credible and it's perceived as consistent. And so having this sort of schizophrenia between different elements is really unhelpful.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think Neil hit the nail on the head there. But one way to look at these projections from various different countries is, if you look out to 2050, even under 1.5-degree scenarios, all the projections expect some residual fossil fuel use and production, with the idea being that we will need to net out the emissions from that production with carbon dioxide removals, right? So there's some fossil fuel production, even under these Paris Agreement aligned scenarios. And one way to look at these projections is there are a number of countries out there that at least hope to meet that demand for fossil fuels. So it's a bit of a tragedy of the commons situation where more than one country expects to be the last one standing. And I think there's probably a bit of that dynamic going on as well. Not all these projections will come to fruition, I would say.
Great, thank you. For the next question from Andrew, he brings up our recommendation for deliberate coordinated policy. How can you pitch this to COP30 and beyond, given the recent International Court of Justice advisory opinion?
So I can take a stab at that. I obviously we can, of course, encourage governments to look more explicitly at fossil fuels. And I think there are some efforts underway to do so. So the Brazilian environment minister in June indicated that one of the outcomes from COP30 could be the development of a roadmap for transition away from fossil fuels, essentially a roadmap that would outline a plan for global cooperation on just transition efforts around the world. So countries essentially sharing ideas and working together, where they're willing to do so, and we would encourage those efforts. Certainly, the ICJ opinion lends some urgency and some impetus to countries to do this. So again, we'll see what comes out of the COP30 negotiations, but there are at least some hopeful signs afoot there.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to take that before I move to the next? Okay, great. We have a couple of questions about carbon removals. I'll take one from Rachel. Thanks for the report and conclusions. For Neil, could you elaborate on the risks of carbon removal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the risk of carbon removal, which we have seen, I think, in international negotiations and climate policy debates for decades now, is that it's a very appealing solution for many decision makers, because it suggests this option of being able to continue with the current energy system, continue with our current fossil-based system, but compensate for that through carbon dioxide removal. And this is an idea that in the literature is called something called mitigation deterrence, where it deters from concerted action to actually address the root cause of the problem, which is the extraction, use, and combustion of fossil fuels. Now, that would be fine if we could scale CDR to whatever levels we want, but we know we can't. The technologies that we might use to drive removals are all very complicated. They're all at very low scales of deployment at the moment. While it's important that we try and incubate those technologies and those approaches and enable them to scale, the idea that they're suddenly going to be able to remove, gigatons by the 2030s or very large amounts by 2050 is just a pipe dream. And so there is a real risk that we over-rely on these options. Now, that said, as we move towards the 1.5 degree limit and as we think about how we get back down, clearly there is a really important role for carbon dioxide removal, but we have to think about very strong and responsible governance and policy structures to make sure that any CDR we do scale up doesn't dilute that pressure to phase out fossil fuels. And one way to do that, and there's many others, would be to have much greater transparency and clarity on government's targets. If government sets separate targets for how much they want to scale up removals versus how much they're going to reduce their actual fossil fuel consumption and use, that would at least provide that first step towards having a separation of the fossil phase out and the scaling up removals, because it would enable us to scrutinize that. There's definitely more work which is needed there to think about how we can scale CDR to bring down temperatures in the way that we need without enabling it to dilute the pressure on a fossil phase out.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you for the question. Next, what fundamentally do you think leads governments to fall so wildly short of 1.5 degrees Celsius targets? Emily, can you take that for us?
I can try. Since the production gap report was first developed in 2019, there's just been a series of global disruptions like COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and several geopolitical conflicts. And so while there's been commitment to a clean energy transition, many countries are just turning back to their outdated fossil fuel dependent playbooks, just really reluctant to challenge these industries whose business models are really threatened by these clean energy alternatives. And a lot of the demand that we see is driven by power plants, new power plants, and what countries cite as economic development priorities, economic diversifications, concerns of electricity supply, the same things that they say always, energy security and things like that. What is less recognized is that renewables offer important advantages over fossil fuels. They provide levels of energy security in addition to better social and environmental outcomes. So I think there's a bit of short-sightedness and instead of, and I think there's also a lack of alignment, just not enough conversations happening potentially within governments to align their long-term energy plans with their climate commitments. So that's just a guess, but this is based on what we're seeing, is that a lot of countries are just not having those conversations, and it's something they'll need to reckon with. And hopefully that happens sooner than later if we're going to stay within our 1.5-degree pathway.
Thank you, Emily. Neil, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would really echo everything that Emily said, and maybe just building on what she was saying at the end there. I think a fundamental issue is a lack of imagination from governments. Governments, potentially we're all somewhat complicit in this, but I think many decision makers have failed to imagine how fast the energy transition can happen, how fast the improvements in zero carbon technologies like batteries and solar power can happen. What we see in the production gap report is governments and decision makers still thinking in straight lines and incremental change. And actually, that's what's in part hampering their ambition. Whereas actually, if we look even just in the last 12 months at the pace of change in some of these key technologies and key options for cutting emissions, we see that rapid reductions are possible, they are feasible, and they would make our lives better. And the more that we can all help governments understand that a rapid transition is not only necessary, but it is achievable and desirable, that will help close the gap between countries' stated aims and the 1.5-degree limit.
Thank you so much, Neil. Next question is from Andrew. How much of a threat do you think investor-state dispute settlement legal cases are, which allows companies to sue countries? Olivier?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take this one. And indeed, I think it's hard to underestimate how big of a threat this is for sustainable development in general. Like we've seen oil and gas company exploiting like these investor-state dispute settlement mechanism within investment treaties, but they've been by far the most litigious sector in these investment treaties, really leveraging this to their advantage and blocking countries to implement climate policies that are aligned with the Paris Agreement goal. So reforms of these investment treaties are essential, and we've seen some really positive development over the past few years with dozens of countries withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, which was one of the worst such multilateral investment treaty, protecting the oil and gas companies from government essentially establishing 1.5-degree aligned phase-out policies. So in case when when renegotiation is not possible, I think withdrawal of these treaties is really important to consider. And yeah, so it's important to keep advancing such discussion in order to enable countries to enact policies that are aligned with their Paris Agreement pledges.
Thank you so much, Olivier. Next, we have a question from James. As a US citizen following the energy transition, I hear conversations about renewable energy's resilience to current policy, given its scalability and cost effectiveness, predominantly solar. In the face of projected energy demand over the next 20 years, have you explored a global future where increased renewable energy demand through private capital leads to diminished fossil fuel production? And could a smaller supporting role of government policies work? Could it be as effective given the current hesitancy of governments to commit to executing stronger climate policies? Derek, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. So one of the really positive stories over the last 10 years, I would say, has been the extent to which the cost of renewable energy technologies has come down. So renewables are now the cheapest form of electricity generation in almost all the world. More than I think it's around 90% of all new electricity generation capacity going in around the world is renewable at this point. So it's moving forward quickly. We can see a lot of renewable energy accelerating deployment around the world. At the same time, it's not fast enough. So if you look at just the share of renewables in total global energy supply over the last 10 years, again, that's hardly moved at all, maybe a little bit. Right. But in essence, all this renewable energy deployment is fulfilling new demand. It's not displacing fossil fuels at this point. So it's not happening quickly enough. It's not displacing fossil fuels. And that is a key reason why we need governments to adopt policies explicitly focused on phasing out, phasing down, and phasing out fossil fuel production. That needs to be an explicit part of climate policy. Focusing on meeting demand with renewables alone is not going to be sufficient. Renewable deployment needs to be accelerated. At the same time, there needs to be deliberate policies focused on ensuring that there is a just and orderly transition away from fossil fuels if we're going to meet our goals under the Paris Agreement in terms of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees.
Thank you so much, Derek, and thank you for the question. Next, we have from Alexandra, considering that more than 80% of oil fields have passed peak, the global average rate of decline in oil supply, this question slipped away from me here. The global average rate of decline in oil supply is greater than 6% and is expected to increase the further away from peak production. This means that as long as oil demand doesn't decline at a rate greater than the oil supply decline rate, there will be pressure to expand production, right? Neil?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alexandra, for the question. And I guess that highlights an important point, which is the distinction between production from existing fields and investment in and production from new fields. So if we think first about the production from existing fields, as the question mentions, the rate of decline of production in those fields is quite high at around sort of 6%. That, I mean, depends if we're talking about the natural decline rate where there's no investment being put in at all, or the observed decline rate where there's sort of continued investment in an existing field to enable further production there. And the International Energy Agency came out last week actually with an updated look at this question, looking at the amount of oil and gas that we can produce from our existing fields, and reconfirmed their finding from 2021, which is that to align with 1.5 degrees, if demand falls in line with 1.5 degrees, then existing fields with top-up investments in them, we're not talking about sort of shutting down the entire industry overnight, it's a sustainable and managed path using those existing fields, is more than enough to meet future demand. And it's only if demand exceeds that 1.5 compatible level that new fields would need to be opened. I guess the other thing that the question raises to me is about how we think about supply and demand. I think a lot of climate policy in the past and still today maybe is very focused on demand and sees sort of shifting fossil fuel demand as the key thing, and then we just allow oil and gas supply to meet whatever that demand is, and that our policies should be focused there. I guess, to me, one of the key points of the production gap report and of the supply side literature is to highlight that there's a duality here, actually, and it's not just that supply responds to demand, but that supply can heavily influence demand. You know, if we do expand oil and gas production and open up new fields, then that can depress global oil and gas prices. It can lead to political and infrastructure lock-in to the fossil economy, and a range of other causal mechanisms by which actually, as we invest in supply, we can influence demand. And so I think that's why it's really important we bring these two things together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. We still have several questions and 10 more minutes. Let's see. From Eve, this might be related. Another new report published today reviews trends in oil and gas demand and their implications for exporting countries. According to the authors, oil and gas demand are set to peak before 2030 and go into slow decline, even without any change in government's policies. This seems to inevitably lead to a huge amount of stranded assets for producing countries and just adds another economic argument against doubling down on production expansion. Thoughts? We also have other questions asking about stranded assets. Perhaps someone can take on these ideas?
Yeah, well, I think that Neil already provided a brilliant answer on the decline rates of demand, and I think the answer would be essentially the same. Is that indeed, like as long as indeed like demand falls within like a 6% rate, about around with the decline rate of existing fields, and there's really no need to open up any new oil and gas field, and this is essentially what is necessary to align with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we can essentially rely on existing fields without opening any new one and meet the Paris Agreement target. And why it's important to look at stranded assets, I think it's like I also disagree slightly with the premise of the question there, as saying that unused hydrocarbon reservoir has no value, because indeed, like oil and gas company does constantly open up new field, partly to meet some key performance indicator and their production to reserve ratio, and that what essentially like boosts the company of the value of the company, their stock prices, and drive like sort of CEO incentives. But why it's important to look at stranded assets themselves is indeed because this is the transition risks that company and government are likely to face if they do develop their licensed reserves that are currently undeveloped, and if there's a final investment decision and they do put in all the capital expenditure in these fields, and then they find themselves in a scenario where the price of oil decrease slightly aligned with the decrease in demand, then their break-even oil price or the operational costs of many of the new fields that are planned to be developed over the coming year have relatively high production costs, which would lead them to be uncompetitive in different scenarios. So it is really key to assess sort of what is the degree of what's the proportion of your new asset that you're planning to develop, they're likely not to be economically viable in different scenarios. And under 1.5 degree scenarios, these are extremely high, but we've done this analysis, and like some NRGI and others have done it for all NOx. We've recently looked at Brazil and Colombia, and we see that these numbers are extremely high, and this also not only impacts the government investing in subsidies that would be lost, or company investing in the capex, but it's also the loss in expected revenues, which can hurt the fiscal revenues of government. So yeah, there's several reasons why stranded asset assessment are important, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Neil, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I guess look, the point I wanted to add on stranded assets is that I feel like often we think about this question by looking at the competition between zero carbon options today and fossil fuels today. And the argument that I want to make is that that's actually slightly misleading, because when we think about investing in a new oil and gas production field or a coal mine, etc., we're essentially locking in some fossil fuel infrastructure for the long term. You know, these are assets that will take potentially multiple years before they even start producing. And then once they start producing, before, you know, if you want to write off the value of the project, that will be 20 years, for example. So we're really talking about not just the competition between fossil fuels and zero carbon now. We're talking about the competition in 5 years' time, and in 10 years' time, and in 15 years' time. Now, if we look at the price and the cost of extracting fossil fuels from the ground, it's basically unchanged over decades. You know, we get better at doing it, but we also extract the cheaper resources first. So we have to go and find the harder resources. And so the cost of digging fossil fuels out of the ground is basically the same over decades. Meanwhile, the cost of zero carbon alternatives gets lower and lower year on year. Last 4 years, the cost of batteries has fallen 30%. Let's fast forward even just to 2030, and let's say the cost of batteries is down another 30%. That's going to be game changing for the competition between fossil fuels and zero carbon. What about in 2035? What about in 2040? I think decision makers are really at risk of underestimating the risk of stranded assets by just comparing today's technologies with today's fossil fuels, when actually the decisions they're making now is about competition in the energy system in the mid-2030s, at which point the level to which renewables, batteries, electrification are ahead of the game is just going to be huge.
Thank you so much, Neil. I will end with a question from Isabel. Going back to the question of why governments fall short, how much do you think that the politicization of the climate crisis contributes to that? And possibly, how do you expect to see that progress in the future? Emily?
I can take a stab at this question. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest changes or observations we'll see in the future is that the climate crisis is happening. It's people are feeling the impacts and they're seeing it. And so at some point, there's going to be some answers needed on how we're going to actually tackle the emissions reductions that are necessary so that those, especially those living in the most vulnerable countries globally, and the frontline communities that are experiencing climate change, they will want to see some progress and towards reducing emissions, fossil fuel emissions in particular. And so I think it's not necessarily when, but if, but it's when. And I think countries really need to reckon with that, the fact that they recognize of the countries profiled, most of them see that there's a need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. There's a need to reduce emissions in general and meet their net zero targets. And so at some point, they're going to have to come up with ways to meet those targets that they've prepared, and come up with a timeline and a transition process. And so this is what we're hoping that will happen now, not sometime in the future, that they start thinking about what they agreed to a few years ago to transition away from fossil fuel. And so we'd like to see some concrete plans in place that will actually show that they do that, because it's not that they don't recognize it. Many have recognized it and have agreed to transitioning away. So now it's just, let's do this. Let's figure out a way forward and see how we can reduce that production gap that we see in our report.
Thank you, Emily. Any last thoughts from anyone on the panel? All right. Well, with that, oh, yes?
No, I would just say, the findings are really sobering, but they are not a fundamental law of thermodynamics. They can be changed, and that requires government action and requires all involved in the system to work for a fairer and more just and fossil-free future.
Great note to end on. Everyone, thank you so much for spending your time with us and learning about this work that we are so proud to share with you. I'd also like to thank Derek, Emily, Olivier, and Neil for sharing findings, answering questions, and offering your expert insight. Thank you also to Ulrika Lamberth, Senior Press Officer at SEI, for supporting our presentation today, and to SEI's Alicia Polschuk for running the technical aspects of this event. On behalf of the Production Gap team, thank you again for your interest and questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.